Okay, so very good. Okay, so thank you and Shavua Tov to everyone. Today we will our discussion will be specifically both practically and also to learn the halachot regarding eating out. There are many questions, right, that come up, and specifically, I hope we get into a discussion about restaurants and what is the issue, what can I trust? Are there other issues in terms of eating out? And last week I told Rav Yair that we will also have a special conversation about dairy products, but I don't think we're going to manage to get into that today. So we'll begin. I just need to, again, I opened it and the other. I'm just trying to manage here in the airport. And I will open up the Gemara. Okay, here we are. Okay, so the question that I want to raise here for the beginning of the discussion is if we knew that if we knew that every product in something that has been cooked is kosher. In other words, I know 100% that we only have a vegetable soup and it is been cooked in a kosher pot or a pot that has not been used for anything besides vegetable. Open for just a discussion before we see the source. Could there be any problem with eating from such a vegetable soup? Is anyone here aware? Again, we have a kosher pot, kosher utensils, we have vegetables and only kosher ingredients that have been used. What could be the problem eating from such a soup? Does anyone here have any idea?
I guess if it hasn't been cleaned for bugs.
Sorry, say it again, louder.
If it hasn't been cleaned for bugs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, so we have the issue of insects of vegetables. So I'm going to make it more difficult now, Sophie. They've been washed and cleaned with soap, checked meticulously. There's no issue with the vegetables themselves. We have two hands up, Justin.
So the one problem could be that the soup was made on Shabbat, for example.
Okay. So in other words, if the soup was made on Shabbat, let's just go into. Yeah, so if it was cooked on Shabbat by someone non-Jewish and it was cooked for you.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a place where it's open on Shabbat and the staff cooking is Jewish.
Okay, so you're saying if a Jew is violating the Shabbat by creating the soup, then even if it was on a Sunday morning that I come there, it would still be a problem to eat the soup because it violated the Shabbat, or it may be on the Shabbat itself. That's a discussion regarding Shabbat laws, but I agree. If someone is violating the Shabbat and that person is Jewish, then it would be problematic for me to enjoy the Shabbat for sure on Shabbat. And if there was benefit for the person after Shabbat, it would be problematic even after the Shabbat. Okay. Any other ideas? Rebecca, you have your hand up?
I just know that in certain kosher establishments, you can have non-Jews working there, but you need to have a Jewish person who's like observing the cooking or seeing that things are doing correctly. I think that's got, I don't know why, but I think it's got something to do with like having the right knowledge or what's considered kosher. I don't know.
Okay, so yeah, so Justin was talking specifically on Shabbat. You're talking about something more general, in that you say that for something to be considered kosher, we have to have supervision. But I would add the word not only supervision, you have to have involvement in the cooking. And we're going to see why that is. And this adds, I would say, some challenges, because I want to be able to eat at, let's say, something we already spoke, I think, in other shiurim. If you have a vegetarian restaurant, maybe they have lobster there and other non-kosher, right, fish. But if it was a pure vegan place, would it still be? Could there still be an issue with kashrut? Or, okay, I'm eating at another person's house, and I know for sure that that person, everything is okay. So this goes into a discussion of involvement in the cooking, and I would like to get into that. And we're not going to go very in depth into the Talmudic discussion itself, but okay, we have also Kuka says if it contains non-kosher wine. That's a very good point, because many, if you go to vegan places today, that you're having a cold salad, for example, it's very important to check the vinegar, because the balsamic vinegar comes from wine. It comes from grapes. So that would be considered non-kosher wine. So thank you for that note. Right, so we're having a cold salad. Nothing is cooked. Everything is okay. For sure, we should just ask the waiter and say, are you, you can even say I'm allergic to wine or something like that. I'm not allowed to have wine or grape, in my products. So they will make sure that it's clean from that. That's a very good point. It's not exactly what we're going to talk about today, but I think it's very good. Okay, so Mia is bringing forward a concept called Bishul Akum. So finally we are hitting the subject that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to see the source for it very soon in the Talmud. The idea of Bishul Akum, the word Akum, Mia, if you already wrote Akum, do you have any idea what does Akum stand for?
Well, so Akum is like a non-Jew. So I think it would be translated like cooking by a non-Jew.
Okay, so it's an acronym. Okay, yes, you're right. It's by a non-Jew, but I think the context is very important. So, I'm going to write in the chat. You can see here that Akum stands for Ovdei Kochavim Umazalot. Ovdei Kochavim Umazalot basically means those who are worshiping the stars of the sky. In other words, idol worshippers. We have to remember that in the context of Chazal, of the sages, the entire surrounding cultures were idol worship. And there's two things that can be connected to kashrut that are relevant because of the surrounding are idol worship. First of all, many ingredients such as spices could have been set to be used, for example, in a temple. Okay, so anything that is connected specifically to idolatry. I'll give you an example. When I was in India, so you go by, and there are actual temples there that they're serving gods, and they're selling spices outside. So those spices, since they were set to be used in a temple, were not allowed to have any part of idol worship and take part in any way. And therefore, even if it was kosher ingredients, or I gave you the example of now spices, if it was bread, and you know that it is a part of the temple for idol worship, again, back in the time of Chazal, you're talking about the entire Roman culture. Even if you bow down to drink from the water, you're bowing down to a goddess in many cases. So the idolatry was really an inherent part of the Roman culture. So therefore, even if everything was kosher, we would have a problem with the fact that we taking part in idolatry. But so the original term is Bishul Akum. Bishul is something cooked by an Akum, and also the fact that we don't trust what is being cooked by an idol worshiper. So we don't even know what is going on, what is happening in the house. Okay, can everyone hear me again?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Am I still spotlighted?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I'm just going to do this from the phone. It's too, I don't know. So we're not going to, I won't share the source with you, and let's just take it simple. These disconnections remind us that we're not actually sitting in the same room, which is the proper way to be learning together. So, but we'll do our best. So Bishul Akum, again, the historical connection is very important to understand that the Jewish, that when Chazal, the Talmudic sages, are setting forward these laws. First of all, what is the surrounding? The surroundings are Roman and then later Christian. In both cases, you have idol worship. We won't go into the details and how we relate to Christianity right now. But so in that sense, we have an issue with eating itself. But now let's take it one stage further. What happens if we don't have an issue with that? Or as the situation is today, that we know that the surroundings around us are not worshiping idols, right? We don't have, we might have remnants of it when we're dancing around some totem pole and or something like that. But no one actually is doing anything today, even I would say in many of the churches that are directly, in a sense, that we are serving idols. So do we still have an issue with Bishul Akum using the term that Mia shared with us? So the answer would be yes. And why? Because besides idol worship, Chazal also added um, gzera, which means a very strong ruling that cannot be bent or changed, saying that because of the fact that we are very wary of intermarriage, therefore we don't want to be in a situation, we want to keep a separation, we want to keep ourselves separate. So therefore, if I were to be eating from, if I were to be eating food and sharing food at the home of a non-Jew, that indirectly or even directly leads to the fact that I will end up in intermarriage. So the Gemara, the Talmud in Masechet Avodah Zarah, adds on this Gzera, which is a very a strong warning, saying we are not allowed to eat from any cooked food that are cooked by Gentiles, even if it's not connected to idolatry. So, however, the same Gemara in Avodah Zarah, on page 37 at the end and then at the beginning of 38, you're welcome to look at it because I can't share it with you right now. You can look it up later after the shiur. So the same Gemara tells us that, first of all, how do we, even before we get into what is actually allowed according to the Gemara, it's according to the Gemara, if we are involved in the bishul, in the cooking itself, then it would be permissible. In other words, if I go into a restaurant and they're cooking, and it's a vegan restaurant or a place that I know is completely clean, I've gone through all the kosher details, and I don't have any questions. It's very simple for me to either turn on the oven or to just turn on the fire myself. And it's very interesting where you have many Israeli tourists that are touring, for example, going back to India, then it's very strange. They know that you want to take a part in the fire. I was once in a restaurant and they told me that I was the god of the fire and therefore I had to light the fire. So that wasn't my meaning when I asked them to light the fire, but I became the god of the fire for them. So maybe that's the opposite meaning because we don't want idolatry. But the point is that if I take part in turning it on, then it becomes, first of all, my involvement itself means that I am a part, and also the cooking itself. By cooking itself, then I'm involved, and I'm not only being served, and in that way, that would be allowed. So that is one way in which I say I don't have Bishul Akum. I don't have cooking by because I'm involved in the cooking myself, which is back to the example that was given. If you have a mashgiach, you have a supervisor, you could have non-Jews. You have many throughout the Jewish world you will be employing non-Jews, and it's under the direct supervision while it's being cooked, and it's also the fire would be lit. In the Jewish community in Malm, for example, so there's someone Jewish who lights the fire every morning. You have non-Jewish women who work in the kitchen. Of course, everything is kosher, but to circumvent this issue, then it will be lit in the morning by someone Jewish, and that involvement gets us out of the prohibition of eating from Bishul Akum. But the Gemara itself, the Talmud itself, in the discussion, says that the prohibition was only set for two specific cases. One of them is that it has to be cooked itself. And the vegetables that are normally not cooked, even if they're cooked, they would not be considered falling under this prohibition. So for example, if I have a carrot and I'm used to eating a carrot, I can be eating it in a salad, I can be eating it raw. If it were to be cooked, it doesn't fall under the prohibition because Chazal was setting this separation within the parameters of having a fancy meal in which you're cooking, maybe it was potatoes and other things at the time that require long cooking. So if it's just a quick cook, then it would be okay. Parameter number 2 is that it has to be a fancy meal. The Gemara, the Talmud, who gives this discussion, the wording used is she'oleh al shulchan melachim. Oleh al shulchan melachim means that it would be something that would be prepared at a king's meal, right? So if you looked at a king's menu, then everything there is obviously, or at a fancy conference, then you wouldn't be getting simple food. So Chazal are saying we're talking about fancy meals because intermarriage comes as a result of sitting in a fancy place together and feeling welcome. So therefore, something which is not oleh al shulchan melachim, something which is not fancy enough, also doesn't come under the parameter of Bishul Akum. Therefore, this raises huge questions because what is considered shulchan melachim? What is considered a fancy meal? I was once talking to the rabbi in Stockholm, Rav Amma Maccabi, a few years ago, and he said, okay, let's check the king's menu. Let's ask the chef of the king. They also prepare kosher meals when we have fancy kosher events, or the Nobel Prize, for example. I once worked with the caterers of the Nobel Prize because the king had a meal in Malmo with representatives from Israel. I was in charge of the Kashrut. So I can tell you what was on the menu, and anything on the menu we can say, well, that for sure is Shulchan Melachim, right? That for sure is on the king's menu. But then we get into questions today. Well, would rice be considered something simple because that's the source? Or is it considered, well, something, every menu today will have rice on it in a restaurant? Very difficult questions to answer. And also it's really dependent, I would say, on the culture that you're in. Is something considered simple or is it not? I would say as a basic guiding principle that something which is served at a fancy restaurant would be considered fancy. Something which is a simple, maybe served at fast food, a falafel maybe, everything there would not be considered. Maybe falafel would not be considered shulchan melachim. I don't know if the king of Sweden is sitting for lunch and having falafel. So in that sense, okay, let's say, okay, so I go to a falafel place. I've checked all of the ingredients. I've checked all of the kilim, all of the utensils. I know that all of it is okay. I know where the pita is coming from, that it's coming from let's say an Arab bakery and it's only flour and water. So that would also be okay, and we'll talk about that soon. So we have a pita, we have vegetables which we said are okay, they're fresh vegetables. And then the cutting knife, and then the knife itself, and then we get to the falafel. So I would say, if we've gone all through all of this, and all we're left with is the falafel is being cooked or fried, then we can say, it's really not oleh al shulchan melachim, and it would be okay. But I've just gone through the process of checking, and you see how many stages and how many things we have to need to check in order to get to that stage of actually checking the falafel itself. But when we talk about restaurants, in many cases, that would be something that is oleh al shulchan melachim. And in a way, Chazal really wanted to separate and make that separation for us so that we're not intermarrying with the culture. We're not assimilating into the culture. And just to remind us that the Jewish community is the only community that has managed to be in the diaspora for 2,000 years and not assimilate. And part of this is the fact, well, you have your own shul, you have your own synagogue, you have your own place where you're eating, and it does create a separation. However, in many cases, I think in many of your cases and mine as well, we're in situations in which we want to be able to manage, and we also want to we know where our separation lies, but we also want to manage to be able to eat out. And in that case, we would have to find whether and ask our rabbi whether we fit these two parameters. I think a good case example would be restaurants that have been popping up more in the later years in Scandinavia that are called raw restaurants, raw, R-A-W. So if you have something which is raw, by definition, it is very strictly vegan. They will check all of the ingredients there. And they will also, by definition, part of their belief system within the raw is that it destroys the vegetables by cooking them. So you want to have the original nutrients from the vegetables. So in that case, it's a perfect example that I can know that I can go in and have a proper meal. Again, I would check the balsamic vinegar, but I would be able to, from the ingredients themselves, I know that I'm okay. And I know that nothing there is actually cooked. So I'm not violating any of the parameters, and it would actually not be considered Bishul Akum. My experience from vegetarian restaurants throughout the world is that they're really not strict, even if they say they are, and that for sure at the level of the utensils and the pots and the pans, they don't have separate systems for that. Whereas we're getting into a situation and more pure vegan are being more aware. It used to be, I would say, even 6 years ago when I was talking to vegan because of this conversation in Sweden, they weren't looking at production lines. They weren't looking at the utensils themselves. I think they're becoming more and more strict, but for us it's a very good thing. So if you have something which is vegan and you have something which is not considered cooked, then that would be okay. Another example, for example, is you can ask the question, how do we drink coffee, for example, because coffee is cooked. So how do you, we all know that we can drink coffee in any coffee house. How is it possible to drink coffee? So the answer would be that that type of cooking, we don't consider falling under the cooking as we have cooking of vegetables. So it's questionable whether eggs, for example, boiled eggs, are a debate in halakha whether they would be considered or not. Coffee would be okay. So if I just walk you through, let's say we're at a hotel and we know that there's a strict vegan menu. So I could have coffee, I could have tea. If I had something which was made of purely vegan again, which was only made of vegetables that are eaten fresh, let's say a stir fry, for example, because there are those who eat onions fresh, even though it's disgusting, but I'll leave it to them to do that. So if you have people who eat onions fresh, you have carrots, you have peppers, you have other things, all of that is not considered cooked because we're used to eating them fresh. So that would be an example of something that I can that I would be able to eat if I were to find that the utensils and everything else is okay. So I mentioned before about bread. Bread doesn't fall under the same category as cooking whatsoever, it's baking. Regarding bread itself, so in halakha, it's very clear that when you're in a place that doesn't have it doesn't have easy access to bread, it is allowed to eat what would be called a pat palter, which is a baker's bread. Because the baker's bread is very simple ingredients, and if we go back to the Middle East, you can imagine we're talking about pita bread. What is it? It's just flour and water cooked in a separate oven. So in that case, it wouldn't be an issue. And even Chazal said, well, it's preferable to eat bread from a Jew that has cooked it, but since it's such an essential part of our diet, and we know that it's pure, therefore it will be allowed to eat. We're allowed to eat a bread. However, in many cases, we will have issues with the bread itself. Anyone, just I've been talking solo for so long, maybe someone wants to add. What could be problematic? I'm going to France now. I'd like to have a baguette. I'm on the street, they're selling a big baguette. I'm having a bagel. I'm just having, one of these sesame bagels in Turkey. Could there be a problem with the bread itself? Anyone?
But this bagel is without meat, right? I didn't get it.
Bagel, but let's just take a French baguette, for example. Okay, and I want to have it. It's fresh. I know that the ingredients are just flour and water, and I just told you it would be okay to eat it, even if it's baked by a non-Jew. So I want your brains to work a bit. What could be the problem? And don't tell me Shabbat, Justin. It's not on Shabbat.
No, I was thinking if that would be milk, but then now you repeated that there is only water and flavor.
So you're right. Bread that is cooked with milk, because milk products are so problematic, bread with milk has a special would be a problem. So we want to make sure there's no milk in the bread. Anyone else?
During Pesach, the chametz, is that an issue? Of course.
Okay, so now you're being like Justin. You're looking for something
Yeah,
very
Justin.
specific. Yeah. Okay. Pesach, of course, is a problem. Cecilia, you have your hand up. We can't hear you.
Good. Cheese on the top of the bread sometimes. This is not
Okay.
accepted.
Okay, so I would add to what you're saying, because here, very easily, and I think I know Sweden very well, you will go to a bakery and you'll see something, you'll see they're praying their bread there, but they've already prepared sandwiches, and it has all this non-kosher stuff in the sandwiches, right? You can even have, you have cheeses which are not kosher, you could have bacon, right, in many times that could be there. So what would be, so of course we want to make sure that the oven is only, right, that the oven is a special oven, that it's being cooked and the sandwiches are not being cooked in that oven itself. And that's a very simple question that you can ask. And I would say that in Scandinavia, we talked about this before, the systems are very reliable because they're very strict in terms of allergies and other things. So if you ask that question, was this cooked in a separate oven? Many times they say, I don't know. And I don't know, obviously, that's a good answer because I prefer them telling me that. And then I know that I can't have the bread. Kuke, you have another idea.
So I was thinking that it might be because, as an example, if they are selling sandwiches that are filled with cheese or ham, if they assemble those sandwiches on the same tables that the bread may be handled on, and also using the same equipment, like as an example, like the oven or bowls or plates or the forks or whatever, to handle both of these different types of foods in the restaurant, so they aren't like properly separated.
Yes. Okay. So thank you. So in other words, we want to make sure that everything is clean. So I agree 100%. Once we know that it's being prepared together with other things, and we see that you have non-kosher products there, that would be problematic. But then you all know that when you look at the kosher list in any of the countries that you are in, you have many, many local breads that are allowed. So we don't have, unfortunately, enough rabbis to be running around daily to all of these factories. So it means that when you have a strong Jewish community, you'll have a Jewish bakery, or you'll have a Jewish mashgiach, a supervisor who will be in a non-Jewish bakery, and that will be fine. But since we don't, so how is it that we permit all of this bread? So besides what is being prepared in the bread itself, the most problematic regarding the bread are some of the additives that are added to the bread themselves, the E numbers, that there are some of them that are problematic. You talked about them last week. So and you can find a list within your kosher list that will tell you which of the E numbers are problematic. So many times, in order to conserve the bread itself, they will add these additives, these preservatives that are not kosher, and therefore bread that would otherwise be kosher becomes not kosher. I'm going to go back to our French baguette and ask again. So we have fresh bread. There's no additives left that have been added. They're cooked in a special baguette oven. There's nothing else. What else could be problematic? Mia?
Yes. So I know there is something about that because we don't have like a Jewish bakery here, we can go to the baker and buy some bread because it's made by a professional, and therefore it should be allowed. But if you just go to some, I don't know, random guy, get a baguette, I guess that would be like kind of violating that, and that would be problematic.
Okay, so what Chazal said for us, just to use your word professional, is basically a professional bakery. So any baker would actually fall under something which is considered professional and would actually be allowed. Someone who's selling bread for a profit is considered professional. So in that sense, we don't have a problem. But none of you have noticed or thought of the fact that the baguettes themselves in certain countries, many times the pans themselves contain animal fat. In Scandinavia, many times, so I would say all of the time, they're using vegetable fat. It just grows here, the canola, right? The rapsoila grows, and it's relatively cheap. So they don't use animal fat on the pans themselves. In certain countries, such as Germany, Italy, other countries, they won't even think of the fact that they're usually using animal fat. In Muslim countries, they won't use animal fat, right? So in that sense, I have to all the time think of, okay, the bread is okay, what else could be problematic? So you can actually ask rabbis in different countries, and when I show up to a country I haven't been to, I ask them what is the norm regarding the bread, are they using animal fat, oil to grease the pans? So if they are not, so let's just go through the process itself. We're talking about bread has been cooked in a separate oven. We know that they have clean ingredients. In other words, flour that has been is normally clean. In some countries, flour is just infested. But let's say that the flour is usually clean in Scandinavia. Flour and water, none of the problematic E numbers which are problematic. And we're going to add to that now that it's been sold by a professional baker, and I know that there's no animal grease used. I've gone through all of that, then I will be able to eat regular bread. So all of the bread that is on the kosher list that you see means that at some point a rabbi has checked the factory and and all of these bread fit all of these categories and these parameters. And of course, we check it once in a while to make sure that it still fits, that it still follows those parameters. For example, now we have an issue coming up that the EU has decided that it's permissible to add grasshopper powder to regular bread. They're considering it nutritious and a superfood. I think it's very good for humanity if we're going to have grasshopper, if we're going to be eating grasshopper powder. As far as I know, it hasn't yet come in. Once it does, we might have to check how we'll have to have stronger control over the situation, because that creates a huge problem when if the regular bread that we have been saying, okay, suddenly have something non-kosher in them, unless that happens to be from a kosher grasshopper. There is one that traditionally we know is kosher, but in the Ashkenazi world, we lost track of that. But there are Yemenites that still eat grasshoppers. I think they eat them pickled, but we can. So the point is that many times new things can come up, and what we assumed was okay then becomes problematic. So what we said, let's to make things clear, or maybe I'll ask you just to make things clear. Anyone want to volunteer? I want to eat bread. I'm out on the street. I'm in a country that, I can trust. Let's say in Scandinavia, what do I need to check in order to make sure that the bread is okay to eat? Besides calling up my rabbi and bothering him on a Sunday morning when he's trying to have some time off with his family. So what are we doing? Kuka, you have your hand up. Are you volunteering?
Okay, so you have to check that all of the equipment that was used for it, like the ovens, and you have to make sure that the ovens, the counters, and the people that are serving the bread, don't have the same maybe gloves on that they had on when they were handling ham or cheese, and then also that, of course, that it doesn't have grasshopper stuff in it or anything like that, and that it was cooked in a specific oven that was meant for it, and it doesn't contain milk or anything.
Great. And then I'll just add regarding the additives, if we're talking about fresh bread, they won't add anything. So it's always good if I actually find, let's say I'm in a country that I don't have a kosher list, it's very difficult to find bread. I'm going to specifically look for a home family-owned bakery, right? Because first of all, I can ask them the questions. They'll usually have a small oven, and the ingredients I'll be able to ask them about. Unfortunately, with the industrialization, as always, we have less touch with the people who are creating, and the people themselves have less touch with the food. But if I'm in a country in which I actually find, a home bakery, and the person is selling the product, and it's not inviting me to his home, the person is selling me the product, they're selling the product on the street, and I can see that the oven is separate, and I know that there's no problem with the oil. So that's and the bread is fresh. Then that is actually a very good option. Most cases with pita bread made by Arabs or by Muslims, I would say in most cases, then that would be the case. So you would find that these pita factories have a specific line and a specific oven just because the ways pita are made, they don't have other bread in the same oven. They have a special process for that. So you'll find that in many cases, or most cases, the pizza would follow under these criteria. Okay, so we talked a bit about the bread, which is very important. If you have a bakery, for example, like you have in Denmark, right? Even if you have at the airport, what's the Lagerhuset? I know I'm not going to manage to pronounce it properly for the Denmark. Justin, do you want to say it properly?
Lavkagehuset. But we
Okay, thank
understood
you.
you.
Okay, Lagerhuset, yeah. So and so you have that. So Rav Yair has put that on the kosher list. He knows the production line. He's checked all of it. But still be very careful, because when you're buying it at the airport, make sure that there's no mix there. It's better to buy maybe a full loaf of bread, because that has been separated the whole time, than the rolls there. But if you see that they're in the back there and that they're being careful about it, then it would be okay. You can ask them to handle it with new gloves, like Kuka just said, and tell them, you know, they're very, I think people are very aware about allergenics. So say, please, I'm sorry to bother you, but could you just take new plastic gloves and take it from the back where it hasn't touched anything. So even if it's on the kosher list, you still have to be very careful, because you have the sandwiches that are being made there. So we talk a lot about the bread, which I think is very important. Let's just step back. We talked about coffee. Coffee would be okay. We're not considering it cooking. And coffee machines in general are used just for coffee. That's what's good about them, especially when you have the capsules now. But any, you know, Swedish bryggkaffe or whatever you call it, you know, simple coffee, the coffee machines, you know them very well. I would say that if it's possible to take a paper cup, because the cups themselves could be washed in the dishwasher with other plates that are non-kosher, for example. But if it's a glass cup, it would also be okay, because the boiling water is like kashering it when it's going through that process. So coffee, paper cup would be better. If it's you could also rely on a glass cup, that would also be okay. Tea is also okay. And we said boiled eggs in a breakfast are questionable, whether it depends on who we rely on halakhically. So you should ask your rabbi whether you can eat a boiled egg at a breakfast. If you have separate vegetables that you know have been cut on a separate cutting knife with a separate knife, many times again because allergenic they are, then you can have some fresh vegetables. You can even ask the person, if it's a family hotel, to cut it separately and to be involved in the process. Going backwards, I'm going to step back to Bishul Akum. Just a note what Mia wrote about Kas Akum, which means bread which was cooked by a non-Jew. We said in our situation, in our circumstances, that would be okay. When you have kosher bread readily available, maybe not so, but in our case, it's totally fine. So that it's not an issue. If we go back, so now we're done with the bread. If we go back to cooking itself, then you hear that it becomes very complicated. The more vegan will become strict about these things, the easier it will be for us. Because if we know that they're being very strict about production lines, about the cooking itself, about the utensils, then we'll be able to rely on that. But unfortunately today, the fact that something says vegan on it, I think Rav Yair showed an example. If you see something vegan, you see that it's actually the production line. Chips today, you can be buying potato chips. It's the same exact line as the bacon chips that have been there 1 hour before. That's a fact. I know that from Sweden. Therefore, that's why we follow the kosher list, so that we check the production line, so that someone is checking it for ourselves. That is what Rav Yair suggested as well. So going back to the cooking itself, the easiest thing, I'm on a vacation with my family and we're being hosted by a non-Jewish family. I tell them in advance I keep kosher. Either I can figure out how to kasher everything. That will be the shiur next week, how we're going to kasher everything in a non-Jewish home. But even so, let's say I kashered everything. I just explained to them that I would like to be a part of the cooking if it's okay. And if it's a friendly family, they won't have an issue. Just say it's part of your religion. Hopefully they respect that. Otherwise, we have to circumvent the parameters. And in order to do so, it has to be something that is not considered Bishul Akum, which, as we said, either it's not considered a king's meal. And we said that is very difficult to define, but something very simple food would not be considered that. Or you're only eating something which could be eaten fresh, and so in that case you would be able to eat it cooked as well. So I think we've gone through today Bishul Akum. We talked about some things which are not considered Bishul. We talked about bread, pat akum or pat kalter, bakery, something which is baked. So any questions? You are welcome now. We have some in the chat. I haven't looked at the chat because I'm on my phone. No, I don't see any question. Okay, any question? Either I've been very clear, I've been so confusing that you're just all lost. Okay, so I think that the shiur is very relevant, and it's something to also take up with your rabbi, because how does this actually work in your community? How does this work with eating out when you want to be able to eat out, which is very important? How are you going to manage with these parameters? What is considered bishul, what is not, what is fancy, what is not? So when you get to the realistic, to the practical question, then of course you should ask your rabbi. So we will say Shavua Tov for now, and Leitzaot to you. I have to actually, I will leave now for my flight. So goodbye for now.
Shavua tov, להתראות.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua tov.
Shavua Tov.
And good trip.
שבוע טוב.
Thank you.
תודה רבה.